Welcome to the Christian Science Monitor for Friday, July the 10th. My name is Pam, and let's begin with our first article. Red Sox Track Record, Racism and Allegations of Sexual Abuse by Michael Resendez, Associated Press, New York. Last month, when former Major League All-Star Torii Hunter said he'd been called the N-word 100 times at Boston's storied Fenway Park, the Red Sox were quick to back him up with a promise to fight racism. Torii Hunter's experience is real, the team said in a June 10th Twitter post, adding that there were at least 7 incidents as recently as last year where fans used racial slurs. The team promised to do a better job dealing with racism. As we identify how we can do better, please know we are listening. But those words rang hollow for more than a dozen black men who have spent the last several years trying to get the Red Sox to listen to their claims that they were sexually abused by a former Red Sox clubhouse manager who died in 2005. The former clubhouse manager, Donald Fitzy Fitzpatrick, pleaded guilty to criminal charges of attempted sexual battery in 2002, admitting that he used Red Sox team memorabilia to lure young black clubhouse workers into secluded areas of the team's Florida spring training facility where he abused them. Mr. Fitzpatrick did not admit to abusing young boys in other ballparks. Since then, a growing number of men have stepped forward to allege that they too were abused by Mr. Fitzpatrick at Fenway Park and at major league stadiums in Baltimore and Kansas City when the Red Sox were playing on the road. Because their claims date to the 1970s, 1980s, and 1990s, they are too old to be included in civil lawsuits, and the men say their requests for out-of-court settlements have fallen on deaf ears. Gerald Armstrong says he believes the team knew that Mr. Fitzpatrick, who worked for the Red Sox for decades, was molesting youngsters hired as bat boys, ball boys, and clubhouse attendants. You can't tell me that you can have 30 or 40 guys traveling around with him and observing his behavior and not knowing what he was doing, Mr. Armstrong said. Mr. Armstrong said that former Red Sox first baseman George Scott, known as the Boomer, frequently told him to stay away from Fritzy. Mr. Scott died 7 years ago. It was another slap in the face for me, says Charles Crawford, an African-American man from Taunton, Massachusetts, after hearing the most recent Red Sox statement about combating racism at Fenway Park. Mr. Crawford alleges that Mr. Fitzpatrick abused him in a locker storage room and in the team showers at Fenway Park when he was 16 years old in the summer of 1991. Now would be a good time for the Red Sox to show everyone they mean what they say, said Mr. Armstrong, who claims he was the first black youth to be hired in the visitors' clubhouse by the old Kansas City Athletics, only to be allegedly abused by Mr. Fitzpatrick multiple times in a stadium storage room and the historic Muhlebach Hotel in downtown Kansas City. When contacted by the Associated Press, Daniel Goldberg, an attorney for the Red Sox, reissued a statement the team released in 2017, noting that Mr. Fitzpatrick pleaded guilty to criminal charges under the team's previous ownership. The Red Sox have always viewed the actions, which date back as long as 6 decades ago, of Mr. Fitzpatrick as abhorrent, the team's statement says. When the team, under prior ownership, became aware of the allegations against Mr. Fitzpatrick in 1991, he was promptly relieved of his duties. Mitchell Garabedian, an attorney representing 21 men who claimed they were abused by Fitzpatrick, 15 of whom are black men, has been pushing for out-of-court settlements with the Red Sox, 3 other teams, and Major League Baseball for years, but to no avail. Recently, following the death of George Floyd and statements about combating racism issued by the Red Sox, Major League Baseball, and several teams, Mr. Garabedian has tried again to open negotiations without success. It's inconceivable to me that they wouldn't want to help these victims in this day and age, said Mr. Garabedian, who is known for his work representing victims of Catholic clergy sex abuse, including those who took part in a 2002 settlement with the Boston Archdiocese. Forbes magazine recently pegged the value of the Red Sox at $3.3 billion, the third among the 30 major league ball clubs. In a recent ranking of billionaires, the magazine also estimated principal owner John Henry's net worth at $2.6 billion. Today's Red Sox, led by Mr. Henry, who also owns the Boston Globe, have labored to shed the team's racist past since buying the franchise in 2002. Under the late Tom Yawkey, the team's former owner, the Red Sox were the last major league team to integrate, signing infielder Elijah Pumpsie Green in 1959, more than a decade after Jackie Robinson smashed the color barrier by signing with the Brooklyn Dodgers. In addition, the Red Sox had a chance to sign Robinson before he went to the Dodgers, and they took a pass on signing fellow Hall of Famer Willie Mays. 2 years ago, the Red Sox tried to step away from the team's racist legacy when it asked the city of Boston to drop Mr. Yawkey's name from a street that runs alongside Fenway Park. The request ignited opposition from a group of civic leaders who said the move would tarnish Mr. Yawkey's record of charitable giving. But the Red Sox prevailed, and today Yawkey Way has reverted to its original name, Jersey Street. Mr. Crawford and Mr. Armstrong, who have long accused Mr. Fitzpatrick of abuse, said the former clubhouse manager used official team caps and baseballs to draw them and others into private settings in major league ballparks and at other locations. Mr. Garabedian said 3 of the 21 alleged victims claim Mr. Fitzpatrick molested them after showing up at a Little League game in Boston and nearby Brockton and telling them he was a scout for Major League Baseball. He was very active, Mr. Garabedian said. Mr. Garabedian is seeking $5 million for each of the 21 alleged victims. But Mr. Armstrong said he's speaking out in large part to encourage all black men who are victims of child sexual abuse to overcome the shame of embarrassment they may feel so they can acknowledge what was done to them and get the counseling that they likely need. I think a lot of black men have been molested, and for cultural reasons, they just don't come forward to deal with it, he said. And if you don't deal with it, you're looking at a lot of emotional problems. Well, this next article is titled, Migrants Have Helped Canada Weather the Pandemic. Will It Return the Favor? By Sarah Miller Lana, Toronto and Montreal. Juan Luis Mendoza has spent more of his adult life on Canadian soil than Mexican. For 8 months of each of the last 30 years, the Mexican agricultural worker has harvested sunflowers, cabbage, peaches, and strawberries from Ontario farms, missing the graduations of his 3 daughters as they moved from elementary to high school to college. Today, as COVID-19 has swept through migrant farms, 3 agricultural workers in the province have already died, and more than 1,000 have been affected among some of the worst outbreaks in Canada. He wipes a tear from behind his glasses, but not because of the virus or the fear of it. You remember all that you missed with your family, all those moments, he says. He recognizes all that he has gained by participating in Canada's temporary foreign worker program, modeled after one in the United States, but he feels that the sacrifices he has made warrant permanent status. And now, he says, people are finally paying attention. We have contributed to the development of Canada, he says, but we have been invisible until this pandemic. Mr. Mendoza joins a growing movement of agricultural and healthcare workers and asylum seekers seeking permanent residence here. And many Canadians agree that the essential nature of their work and sacrifice during the biggest modern threat to Canadian life should be recognized, much the way immigrants in the U.S. are fast-tracked to citizenship if they serve in the American military. Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau had said he is looking into the possibility of granting asylum seekers on the front lines of healthcare permanent status in Canada. They joined a global movement sparked by the precarity that has been exposed by the pandemic. In Paris, more than 5,000 marched for legislation of the sans papers, or unauthorized workers. In Portugal and Italy, governments have granted temporary rights to workers, while in Lebanon, where maids were abandoned by families who said they could no longer afford to pay, a push to the end of the kafala system, in which domestic workers are tied directly to one's family, has grown. Over the weekend, asylum seekers, unauthorized workers, and migrant workers protested in Canadian cities demanding more rights and protections amid the pandemic. It's part of a broader reckoning during this pandemic in the kind of profound irony and hypocrisy that a lot of the most essential workers in our economies are often the worst treated and lowest paid, says Edward Dunsworth, a historian of migrant agricultural labor in Canada and soon assistant professor of history at McGill University in Montreal. Guardian angels in a precarious situation. The movement for migrants has gained much traction in Quebec, the epicenter of Canada's COVID-19 crisis, with half of all cases and more than 5,400 deaths. Some 80,000 of those have occurred in long-term care facilities, which were so depleted by the pandemic that the military had to come in to assist this spring. So too did asylum seekers, says Wilner Caillot, an activist with the Quebec-based advocacy group Débat pour la Dignité, which means stand up for dignity. He says between 1,200 and 1,400 asylum seekers are working in Quebec's healthcare sector, including many from Haiti and North Africa, and a large portion of the workers are non-white women who are living in poverty. Quebec Premier François Legault began referring to these home care workers as guardian angels. It's a stark reversal from the rhetoric that propelled him into office in the first place. In August 2017, he said Quebec couldn't be expected to accept all the world's miseries. Now many recognize the service of those escaping misery, men like Lahussine El-Aban, who came to Canada in 2016 and began a job as an orderly at a long-term care home north of Montreal in mid-April, making sure elderly patients there were well fed, clean, and comfortable. His first shift started a week after his daughter Gala was born. He didn't want to worry his wife, but his own anxiety rose with each red marker placed outside residents' rooms to mark positive COVID-19 cases. I thought about quitting, he said. Every day you would see funeral homes arriving with their stretchers to pick up a patient who had passed away. They were long days, long, long days. Today, as those numbers have gone down, he faces another uncertain road ahead. His original refugee claim was denied, and he resubmitted an application for permanent residence in March 2020. Now he waits. Mr. Caillot said many asylum seekers are suffering psychologically because they are unsure whether they will face deportation once the pandemic ends and their jobs are no longer deemed essential. François Legault compared them to guardian angels. Justin Trudeau called them humanitarian workers. Yet despite that glowing rhetoric, we still left them in a precarious situation as to their migration status, he says. And the current proposals pertain narrowly to healthcare workers, launching a conversation about what essential means and why food processors or security guards in care homes, for example, wouldn't also fit the definition. This issue of status. Patty Leonard, an associate professor at the University of Ottawa's Graduate School of Public and International Affairs, says all of those who need protection in Canada should be granted it. Still, she likens the moment to grant healthcare workers a path to residence to Mr. Trudeau's promise in 2015 to resettle 25,000 Syrian refugees in Canada. The political class and the public were on board then, just as they are today. There's a political will here today in a government which has been pretty reluctant to recognize the claims of asylum seekers and refugees and is pretty hostile to certain categories of immigrants, Dr. Leonard said. Among them are temporary workers who number as many as 60,000 every year to work in agricultural and food production. This year, the program, central to Canada's food security, was initially in doubt over possible border closures. It went forward with workers required to quarantine for 14 days upon arrival in Canada, but still the virus spread, many public officials say, because of bunkering arrangements. Dr. Dunsworth says his research has shown that as programs have grown in scale since the first was established in 1966, and as Canadian farming has become more centralized corporate industry, conditions have worsened for the workers. But it's been hard to draw attention to that, in part because of the program's juxtaposition to American farming. Because of how prevalent undocumented labor is on farms in the U.S., these managed migration programs are actually seen in a more positive light compared to the abuses and the ever-present dangers for undocumented workers, he says. He says permanent residence for temporary workers would protect them, giving them the power to walk away from an abusive boss, unsafe conditions, or, particularly relevant in today's environment, poor living conditions. It doesn't mean, he says, that they would necessarily or even want to stay in Canada permanently. Permanent residence wouldn't solve every single issue, he says, but a lot of these problems really lead back to this issue of status. Syed Hussain agrees. As executive director of the Migrant Workers Alliance for Change in Toronto, he's trying to protect the rights and welfare of migrants, unauthorized workers, and refugees in Canada. But it's an uphill battle. For example, Ontario Premier Doug Ford recently changed rules to allow workers who test positive but are asymptomatic to continue working. I think it's very possible that there's a huge instinct and a desire to return to normal, Mr. Hussain says. Normal was just not good enough. Moving on. Kashmir's media survived blackout, but warn of shrinking freedoms, by Fahad Shah in India. 2 months since photojournalist Masrat Zahra was booked by Indian police under an anti-terror law, she says, "I still fear that I might be detained anytime." A resident of Srinagar, the summer capital of Indian-administered Kashmir, Ms. Zahra was charged in late April for posting her work on social media, including a photo of a protester with a banner of popular Kashmiri rebel commander Burhan Wani, who was killed in July 2016. In a statement, police said Ms. Zahra was uploading photographs which can provoke the public to disturb law and order, tantamount to glorify anti-national activities and dent image of law enforcement agencies, besides causing disaffection against the country. Born and raised in Srinagar, she often watched protests against security forces and Indian rule, but found it strange that the photographers were only men. In university, she enrolled in science classes, but secretly studied for a journalism program against her parents' wishes. Today, at 26, she is one of Kashmir's only women photojournalists and even has support from her parents. But over the past years, Ms. Zahra and other journalists in long-troubled Kashmir, one of the world's most militarized regions, have faced increasing risks in their work. Risks that could make independent reporting all but impossible, some argue. They include a months-long internet shutdown for much of the past year, the longest ever imposed in a democracy. Ms. Zahra is not the only journalist in Kashmir to face questioning. Another journalist, Gowhar Gilani, was also booked under the same law, the Unlawful Activities Prevention Act, or the UAPA, which can carry sentences of up to 7 years for the same reasons. While Ms. Zahra and Mr. Gilani have been released, the investigation continues. Several other journalists have been summoned by police in the past few months or accused of reporting fake news. Increasing risks. Islamabad and New Delhi have disputed the wider Kashmir region for decades, and thousands have been killed as rebels fight Indian rule. Indian-controlled Kashmir and Jammu was the country's only Muslim-majority state until late August 5th, when the Indian government unilaterally stripped it of its semi-autonomous status and carved it into 2 union territories ruled directly by New Delhi. Officials imposed a strict curfew and cut communication channels, which they argued was needed to restore order and avoid violence amid protests. Many reporters without internet facilities sent texts, photographs, and videos in thumb drives to New Delhi. Anuradha Basin, executive editor of the Kashmir Times, says that in the past, successive governments have made attempts to gag media by bringing in democratic policies, actions, and laws. But the media fraternity has been successful in thwarting such attempts. However, she adds, the present policy is extremely stringent, and we seem to be living in different times. Unless the media is united and ready to challenge this ugly policy, I don't see much hope for the future. Ms. Zara, who has since continued to work, says that journalists are constantly being harassed, intimidated, summoned, and booked. The case has been a shock for me. I'm new in the field, and getting booked under this draconian law was really unexpected. I couldn't sleep for so many nights, she said. Mental trauma continues, but I also don't want to stop working because I think all journalists in Kashmir face such pressure, and we have to be ready for it. Similarly, the editor of a new website in South Kashmir, Quasi Shibli, was detained last summer and booked under the Public Safety Act after tweeting and reporting on the deployment of troops in Kashmir just before the state's special status was revoked. He spent 9 months in jail in Uttar Pradesh, some 660 miles from home, accused of anti-national activities. Under the law, a person can be imprisoned for up to 2 years without trial. I've been seeing psychiatrists and doctors as well. It's just that the solitary confinement of nearly 9 months with a rare human visit now and then has caused deep psychological distress, says Mr. Shibli, who was released in April and has since restarted his work. In May, a new 53-page media policy was put in place, allowing officials to detect and punish fake news and media they deem detrimental to the sovereignty and integrity of India. The policy also adds that government agencies will do background checks of newspaper editors to determine which are eligible to run government ads, and of staffers for accreditation. Most journalists view the rules as an attempt to encourage self-censorship. Ms. Basin, whose newspaper has been barred from publishing government advertisements, says that it is an attempt to kill journalism through a systemic policy of surveillance and control of media. Much of this was already happening, she says, adding that the new policy is not only a tool to suppress journalism who ask uncomfortable questions, but also individuals who exercise their right to free expression. Kashmiri journalists are left with just 2 options, she adds. Either they become vehicles of government publicity departments or continue their work professionally at the risk of facing consequences. Though much internet access has been restored, most major newspapers here have continued to refrain from questioning the government or reporting on conflict. Outside appreciation. Yet this spring, Kashmir's media had a moment to celebrate. 3 photojournalists working with the Associated Press, Dar Yassin and Mukhtar Khan, who are from Kashmir, and Chani Anand, who is from Jammu, won the Pulitzer Prize for their photographs of Kashmir's lockdown. Within hours of the announcement, India's social media and several members of the ruling party accused the Pulitzer Board of being biased. At such a difficult time, to win the most prestigious award, of course, is encouraging, says Mr. Shibli, expressing his gratitude to the journalists. The world needs to see Kashmiri journalists is putting enough at stake to present them the realities from ground zero. Despite all odds, people here continue to work, even if it is meant smuggling pen drives or USBs out of Kashmir to send pictures and videos, says Ms. Zara. This shows the level of dedication and hard work. In the process of telling stories, journalists here become the stories. Amid this, the recognition has shown how journalism in Kashmir plays a significant role. That message set in after the Pulitzer Prize in May, and again in June, when Ms. Zara won the 2020 Anja Nedgringha's Courage in Photojournalism Award from International Women's Media Foundation. Speaking on behalf of Kashmiri journalists, Ms. Zahara says that her award was a recognition of our hard work and honesty towards the profession. It was acknowledgement that the world is witnessing and reading our stories. It gives us more strength and courage. Well, this next article is titled Polish Coal Industry Battered by Virus as Global Demand Plummets. With the global coal market already in steep decline, Poland's mines are facing another threat from the coronavirus. While miners number 80,000 in the country of 38 million, they account for 1/5 of the nation's virus cases. By Vanessa Guerra of the Associated Press. Warsaw, Poland. The coronavirus has ripped through Poland's coal mines, where men descend deep underground in tightly packed elevators and work shoulder to shoulder to extract the source of 75% of the nation's electrical power. Of Poland's more than 36,000 reported COVID-19 cases, about 6,500 are minors, making them nearly a fifth of all confirmed infections in the country, even though they make up only 80,000 of the country's population of 38 million. The virus hotspots, centered in southern Silesia regions, have paralyzed an already troubled industry, forcing many to stay home from work and triggering a 3-week closure of many state-run mines that are only now reopening. It is one more blow that the pandemic has dealt to the global coal sector, already in steep decline in much of the world as renewable and other energy sources get cheaper and societies increasingly reject its damaging environmental impact. Economic shutdown from the virus also have cut electricity demands. Britain completely removed coal-fired power from its grid for 67 days starting April 9th, a record set since the Industrial Revolution as the national grid works towards a zero-carbon system by 2025. Coal is in a long-term decline, said Bob Ward, Policy Director at the Grantham Research Institute on Climate Change and the Environment at the London School of Economics. It's simply cheaper to use gas or renewables, and the economics of coal just no longer make sense in many parts of the world. The question is whether the recent sharp reduction in coal use is sustainable and will last beyond the impacts of the pandemic, Mr. Ward said. United States coal companies, already in financial trouble, are more likely to default because of the pandemic. According to S&P Global Market Intelligence, Italian utility Enel says it will be able to close coal-fired power stations that it operates across the world sooner than anticipated due to the virus. But China, the world's biggest emitter of greenhouse gases, actually has been accelerating plans for new coal power plant capacity as it tries to revive its virus-hit economy. Poland, under pressure from the 27-member European Union to lower carbon emissions, is seeing the pandemic complicate its coal troubles. Poland is the only EU state refusing to pledge carbon neutrality by 2050. Governments in Warsaw have argued for years that as an ex-communist country still trying to catch up with the West, it cannot give up the cheap and plentiful domestic energy resource. It also says its reliance on coal is important for weaning itself from Russian gas. In reality, Poland's coal production is becoming less efficient, and it has increasingly been importing cheaper coal from Mozambique, Colombia, Australia, and even Russia. As it does so, Poland's own coal piles up unused, and some mines have been closed. Look what's happening with coal. How many millions of tons are being imported from outside Poland, and it was supposed to be completely different, Warsaw Mayor Rafał Trzaskowski said at a campaign rally in Silesia. He faces conservative President Andrzej Duda in a presidential runoff election Sunday. Piotr Lewandowski, president of the Institute for Structural Research in Warsaw, says Poland's coal sector is being pushed to a tipping point by several factors. Falling demand for coal because of warmer winters, wind and other renewables become cheaper, rising costs of carbon emissions, and a society less willing to tolerate high levels of air pollution. As coal mines struggle, their stock of unsold coal is the highest it's been in 5 years, Mr. Lewandowski said. The mines are between a rock and a hard place. They need to manage the outbreak while they are in financial tatters. In an open letter Friday to Prime Minister Mateusz Morawiecki, some 40 environmentalists, scientists, and other groups urged him to urgently prepare a plan for phasing out coal use in order to receive EU funds for making a transition to a greener society. They said the pandemic has sped up the economic, ecological, and social problems associated with coal. Miners, however, worry the government could use the outbreak as a pretext to permanently shut inefficient mines. Conservative leaders have tried to calm those fears, aware of the political costs of job cuts to the industry. When communism fell in Poland, it still had about 390,000 coal miners. Layoffs created high unemployment and poverty in Silesia, and miners staged violent protests in Warsaw. Jacek Sasin, the deputy prime minister in charge of mining, insists there is no reason for miners to fear for the long-term prospects. All those who tried to argue that reduction was some sly plan to liquidate mines talk nonsense, he said. Certainly, nobody expects any big decisions about coal before Sunday's election between Mr. Duda, the incumbent, and Mr. Trzaskowski. Coal miners already are frustrated by stagnant wages and a feeling the government is less committed to supporting them, says Patrick Kozlea, a spokesman for a miners' trade union, Serpian 80. Adding to their concerns have been long waits for coronavirus test results and a state mining institute report issued at the start of the pandemic that said miners were not at risk. It was wishful thinking, Mr. Kozlea said. In mining, you work in tight groups. You go down in a packed, small lift, people are crowded. Then you travel on an underground train, together, rubbing shoulders. Polish miners normally wear only goggles and helmets with lamps, but one of the biggest companies said it supplied masks and disinfectant and implemented other hygiene measures at the start of the outbreak. It was unclear how many workers actually wore the masks. The virus spread very fast, Mr. Kozlea said. The good news is that very few have faced serious complications and many have recovered. Some are surprised that they are infected because they feel fine, he said. Adam Heckelman, a miner who recovered from the virus, blames the government for the high infection rates and the other troubles in the sector. They had lost interest in us, said Mr. Henkelman, who works in the Murksy Stasic coal mine in Katowice. We don't know what tomorrow will bring. All right, let's move on to this next report. Some numbers are less certain than they appear, by Melissa Moore. When is 100 not 100? This might sound like a riddle, but it's an interesting question. We tend to think of English words for numbers as precise terms having stable, unique relationships with particular reference. These words can almost seem like parts of mathematical equations. 100 equals 100, just as 102 equals 100. But language is slipperier than that, and 100 is not always 100, nor is a billion always 1 billion. The Anglo-Saxons had two different hundreds, Hung Tiantig, 100, the short hundred, and Hund Twelfthig, 120, the long or great hundred. They followed the Germanic practice of counting in tens up to 120, according to historian Julian Gudar. In fact, the word hundred was more likely to refer to 120 than 100 until the 16th century. If you bought 100 eels or chickens or sold 100 measures of oatmeal, you were really talking about 120. Professor Gudar speculates that the popularity of the long hundred might be partly attributed to tax evasion. In the Middle Ages, duties were levied on merchants as flat fees per 100 units. So if your hundred was actually 120, you could charge your customers more, but pay the same tax. Sometimes, however, 100 wasn't 120 either. 100 pounds of groceries in the 18th century London actually weighed 104. There were 124 cod to the hundreds, 128 herring, 132 mackerels, and 240 crabs. Most long hundreds became short hundreds in the 16th to 17th centuries, where arithmetic began to be taught in schools, but they lingered on when counting agricultural commodities. Billions and trillions were defined along scientific principles, but they can be almost as unreliable. 15th and 16th century French mathematicians wanted to be able to talk about numbers greater than a million, so they named 1,000,002 a billion, 1,000,000,003 a trillion, 1,000,000,004 a quadrillion, and so on. This is a rational system. The word for a million squares used bi, a Latin prefix meaning two. A million cubed is tri, meaning three. To the fourth power is quad, etc. This makes a billion 1012 and a trillion 1018. The values they hold in Europe, as many French and Spanish speaking countries around the world, which use this long scale. Other mathematicians advocated for a scale that instead went up by multiples of 1000, which made for finer verbal differentiation. On this short scale, a billion is 109, and a trillion is 1012. The definitions were familiar within the United States and in Britain, at least since 1974. Before then, Britain used the long scale, and 109 was a milliard. If you could count a billion herrings, how many would there be? Let's be content with a lot. Well, that ends the reading of today's Christian Science Monitor for Friday, July the 10th. This is Pam saying thank you for spending time with me. Please stay in, stay safe if you can, be blessed, and make it a great day.